Hello and welcome to episode 228 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perriton, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 at Pearl Harbor, and many other assignments. How are you this fine morning, Bill?
I'm doing great. I'm thinking maybe we don't need to explain to everybody who I am in season 3 because everybody's heard that so many times. I think they've got it memorized.
I actually have it memorized. I say it in my sleep sometimes. But before we get started, we want to do our cursory reminder to please like and subscribe to our channel. Just saying, I've noticed the subscriptions going up, and we very, very much appreciate that. Please keep them coming. It helps people find our show, and we just want to make sure everybody here's what we have to say, whether you like it or not. But anyway, so that's the PSA for today. So on with the show.
Yeah, the good news, Seth, is that most people seem to like it. I think we're getting 98% positive, 1% constructive, 1% ignore kind of comments. And so that's not bad. And as we're recording this today, we are just teetering at that 2 million views mark, which is absolutely phenomenal. We thank you all for that.
Very, very much. Thank you all. If it wasn't for people watching, it's, Bill and I still wouldn't be doing this. So, but thank you very much for everybody who has tuned in through these last 2 seasons. All right. So on with the show. The first day at Betio has passed into memory now, and more like nightmares for those lucky enough to have survived that first day. The carnage on the beaches was almost indescribable. Stacks of Marine bodies littered the beaches at positions inland. Bodies of Marines washed ashore or were brought out to sea, where their remains sometimes bumped into the sides of the support ships several miles away from the scene of battle. The slaughter had been absolutely horrifying, but despite the massive casualties, some 1,500 Marine dead, wounded, or missing among the Marines, the young men of the 2nd Marine Division made some limited gains. At Red 1, a small pocket of men had pushed several hundred yards inland. On the other side of the 600-yard gap separating Red 1 from Red 2 and 3, Colonel Shoup and Majors Crow and Chamberlain had also advanced several hundred yards inland and captured part of the airfield. That night, the men held the line against Japanese infiltrators, anxiously awaiting the dreaded night counterattack that, as the sun rose, became apparent would never come, at least not that night. As dawn broke, the Marines ashore scrounged among the bloated bodies of their brothers for food, water, and ammunition. Despite the casualties, despite the equatorial heat, despite the Japanese defenders, the Marines must advance today and wrap this fight up. The cost would be high, but like the first day, heroics would abound up and down the island as Marines continued to carve out their legacy on what was now being called Bloody Betio. Bill, this first 24 hours essentially 24 hours has essentially passed into memory. And, in the intro here, we made a big deal about, and at the end of last week's episode, we made a big deal about the Marines surviving this first 24 hours, surviving this expected Japanese counterattack. I don't want to understate why this is so important. I think we need to talk about this before we move on to actually what happens at day 2. We talked about USS Ringgold. One of her salvos actually killing Shibazaki, and that's one of the main reasons that the attack did not occur. But this beachhead was weak. We did not. It was shallow and it was weak, right? If this counterattack comes, this could potentially be bad news for the Marines.
No, that's exactly right, Seth. And going back to the map here, this area here, known as the pocket, right in here, was still very, very heavily defended. Marines had penetrated a little bit on the western side. And of course, we remember Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. Red 3 had not advanced much at all. There's very fierce resistance still essentially at the beach at this point in the battle. And so, yeah, it was a very tenuous, very tentative, here we go, very tentative hold at this point. Only by luck and the fact that the Japanese commander commanding admiral, remember, these are all sailors defending Betio, not Japanese Marines. Only by luck was the admiral killed in that counterattack in the first night not occur. But very tenuous. The Marines are running out of ammunition. They're running out of water, and most of the radios don't work, and so they don't have the ability to call home for help. And that's kind of the situation we find ourselves.
Yeah, and it can't be understated that if the Japanese do counterattack, and we don't do what ifs on this show, or at least we try not to very often, but this is one of those things that you have to talk about because it's so damned important that if the Japanese do launch that night counterattack, if these guys come crawling out of their positions all over the island and come smack the Marines, or at least one section of the Marines, in the face, they're likely to throw some of these guys back into the sea. And I don't believe that's an overstatement. I mean, at Red 1, they had barely penetrated inland. Their hold was very, very weak, very tenuous, and they had a 650-yard gap between Red 1 and Red 2. So if the Japanese hit that area, things are bad. And if the Marines are pushed back into the sea at Red 1, I'm not saying that the whole invasion fails, but there's a possibility that it could have happened. So to further emphasize that lucky shot, which is exactly what it was, by USS Ringgold, that changes the complexion of what could have happened that first night. With Shibazaki being dead and his whole command staff being dead, that literally changes the way the battle is probably fought. And I don't believe that to be an understatement.
Not at all. And of course, the Marines know they have a job to do this morning. They absolutely have to get off the seawall and establish an offensive perimeter in depth, something that can be, defended. They've got basically no cover or concealment where they are on the beach for most of the Marine lines. And as they get into the closest thing that there is to jungle, at least they can get some concealment, if not cover. And so it's really important that they start driving inland. Now, for Colonel Shoup and his folks. So Colonel Shoup decides his main task is to drive a wedge between the Japanese and split the island in half. In that way, divide the Japanese lines. They might have a better chance of, kind of defeating the Japanese bit by bit. And so in so doing, he orders Ryan's men at Red 1. And again, remember, Red 1 here is to the west. Right over here, he orders Ryan's men at Red 1 to push across their sector and secure the coast all the way across to Green Beach down here. And so that was kind of the objective at this point, Seth.
Yeah, and he's seeing that, to your point exactly, he needs to cut the head off of the snake on that side of the island over there. And he needs Ryan's people to expand that beachhead so they can at least have something to hold, God forbid, if the Japanese do decide to counterattack, which it's almost inevitable. They're going to at some point. It's just a matter of when. He also tells Major Crow over there at Red 3 to reduce the defenses in front of him that had given him so much trouble all day long on D-Day. What Crow is facing at Red 3 are these huge concrete defenses and emplacements. These things are massive. This is right by, not far from Shibazaki's original command post. These are huge bunkers that are literally just stopping Crow and his Marines over there, the 8th Marines, just stopping them dead in their tracks. But Shoup says, you've got to get through these things. You have got to move through. He tells him to reduce the defenses in front of him. And in Shoup's sector at Red 2, which is dead smack in the middle of the American invasion layout right there, these Marines here would be driving the wedge that Bill had talked about to split the island all the way to the southern shore. At this point in the morning on day 2, Shoup's radio, now a lot of the radios, as you were saying, Bill, is 100% accurate that the radios weren't working. Some of them were. Shoup's radio, thank goodness, actually was. He immediately requests resupply from the ships offshore. The men need ammunition, they need food, they need water, they need medical supplies, basically all the intricate details that they need to fight and win this battle. they're running out of, and they need this material like yesterday, literally. So he makes that frantic radio call. He's not screaming, but he's pleading to send these supplies ashore. Over at Red 1, Major Ryan launches his attack, the attack that you just talked about, Bill, at 11:20. With him, literally standing next to him, was a Navy gunfire spotter who had a rarity on the island, what we just said, a radio that actually worked. The spotter was on the horn directly with a destroyer patrolling several thousand yards offshore. Frankly, it's not the USS Ringgold. I do know that for a fact, but I don't remember what destroyer it is, so forgive me on that one. Standing directly in front of Ryan's push were 2 Japanese 5-inch guns and over a dozen of these anti-boat guns. If you remember on the D-Day assault, these anti-boat guns, Bill, they were pouring fire into these LVTs. And then as the LCVPs, the Higgins boats, are coming closer, they're pouring fire into these things too. And once, of course, the Marines get ashore, these anti-boat guns are pumping rounds into the gyrenes they're holding up at the seawall. So these 5-inch guns and these anti-boat guns, they've got to go. Ryan desperately needs that naval gunfire support. So shortly before Ryan's assault kicks off, this gunfire supporter, who again, we do not know his name, requested a call fire mission. The destroyer offshore begins firing salvos, walking them closer and closer to the Marine lines until the spotter had the 5-inch salvos dropping less than 50 yards in front of the Marine lines. As soon as the 5-inch fire stops, the Marines jump off, Bill. The assault, it goes pretty good, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Actually, within an hour, Ryan's men have seized large chunks of ground against a dazed and minimal resistance, which is, again, another rarity for the Japanese at this point. His front now stands along the entire west coast of Betio. So we're talking about the west coast here. So he's able to finally get some leverage on that west coast. It's also surprisingly, he advances relatively quickly, and he pivots and begins that advance. And again, keep jumping back to the map. So he gets across the west coast, pivots, and begins the advance inland like that. And so, it's really helpful to understand that he's kind of trying to keep his flanks protected as he does that inland advance towards the airfield, to establish a link between the beachheads and combine those into one cohesive front, Seth.
Yeah. And one aspect of Ryan's attack here, excuse me, his attack here and the success that he meets with here is that he rolls up that shoreline, like you're saying, Bill, and he finds, once he clears those anti-boat guns and those 5-inch guns, and he gets past that initial line of Japanese defenses, and we said this before, that the Japanese defenses were on the beach, they weren't necessarily in depth. This is very true here, because he punches through that area, he goes past Green Beach, and he finds that Green Beach is undefended. There is not a Japanese to be seen on this thing, and there are virtually no Japanese defensive positions here. So even if the Japanese were to counterattack, they're not going to counterattack and put their people in anything, because there's nothing there. So he immediately sends, he has one of his Marines send semaphore to the destroyer that was providing the offshore naval gunfire and says, this, I am Major Ryan of, and this Green Beach is undefended. Please send all reinforcements to Green Beach. This is huge, man. So now the Marines that are waiting offshore, the 6th Marines, or some of them anyway, they can make their way ashore for the most part without being torn to shreds like the Japanese, like the Marines had done or had done to them on D-Day. This is going to allow precious reinforcements, supplies, food, ammunition, water, medical supplies, getting some of these wounded people out of here. This Green Beach capture is massive for the survival, not just of the Marines at Red 1, but all of the Marines on Betio at this point, Bill. This is a huge deal, huge deal.
Yeah, absolutely, Seth. And again, going back, you can see that the third of the 6th Marines right here, they come in and they start driving. So, it's important to remember that there was some reserve held back, and a lot of these reserve units now can get ashore and start relieving these, decimated assault troops that have been there since, H hour on D-Day. Colonel Shoup never breaks his demeanor throughout. Remember, he came ashore late-ish in the battle, tried to stay offshore while his initial waves were coming ashore to make sure he understood how the battle was developing. Once he gets ashore, he never breaks his demeanor. He remains calm in spite of the threat of being overrun several times and, defeat staring him in the face. It is not resolved yet that they're going to win.
Right.
And so Robert Sherrod did notice, however, that Colonel Shoup's hands would shake whenever he was on the phone, and he spoke in a hurried and nervous manner. He tried to look calm, but his voice was belying his actual mental state at this point. So with the addition of the 6 Marines on Green Beach coming ashore, Shoup's shakes would taper off a little bit. Then at 1100 at Red 2, Lieutenant Wayne Sanford led Foxtrot Company, they didn't call it back in the Foxtrot Company in those days, F Company, in the assault by saying, "Come on, boys, we can't win the war by sitting here." So him and about 70 Marines ran clear across the airfield. So again, I want to kind of push this. He's at Red 2, and he runs clear across the airfield, which is really bizarre, and it kind of, what's going on here?
Yeah.
But they're under heavy machine gun fire the whole time. And astonishingly, they reach the other side without suffering a single casualty. Sanford's assault team caught the Japanese off guard, probably saving him and his men significant, a fusillade. And so sometimes shock and awe does work, Seth.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly what happened, is that he got up and he got his people moving so fast that the Japanese didn't even see it coming. There was no preparatory artillery barrage. There was nothing like that. They just got up and ran, and it caught the Japanese off guard. Now, once they get over there on the other side of the island, they do start receiving some pretty significant fire. The Japanese start to react, and they do start picking some of these Marines off as they continued their advance over in that. It was like a spear, boom, poking a hole through the line. And then the Marines started to expand on another side of the beach. And as this happens, they start to take casualties. Sanford himself is actually shot by a Japanese rifleman, taking the round through his chin into his jaw. He would survive, and his assault with the men of F Company successfully does cut Betio in half. The Marines never give up this position. They wind up punching that hole through their bill, and they hold this sucker. Within an hour of him getting hit, Sanford is evacuated, and over 200 Marines filled F Company's recently taken position. So again, this is a huge, huge deal. All those stymied advances on D-Day are, and I'm not saying that the Japanese suddenly broke, because that's not what happened here, but the assault caught them off guard to where these Marines could get across. And then once they got across, these other Marines kind of filled in that hole, they filled in that gap. And now the Japanese are cut off. You got the Japanese cut off on the eastern side over there by Crow and Red 3. And then you've got this like massive pocket now in between Red 1 and Red 2. And these two forces can just start constricting that pocket together. This is a massive thing, Bill. This is huge.
It is. And then enter our Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins again. You'll remember from day one, from our last episode, that William Hawkins, or Hawk for short, was the first American to land on the soon-to-be bloody sands of Betio. He and his scout snipers had fought their way up the pier, you'll remember that, eliminating Japanese wherever he encountered them. His advance along the pier was cut short when he was forced to withdraw due to heavy enemy fire. Now, his orders for today were to take his scout snipers and attack a series of Japanese positions 100 yards west of Colonel Shoup's CP. And moving out quietly at 0630, Hawk and his men advance towards their objectives. Hawkins leads from the front and insists on personally assaulting each and every position his team encountered. And about 75 yards inland, Hawkins crouches next to a Japanese position and begins flinging grenades through the firing slit. As the grenades began to go off, one was thrown back and exploded directly in front of him, shredding his chest with shrapnel. Collecting his wits, Hawkins continues to throw grenades despite the serious wound he just suffered, successfully knocking out the position. Then him and his team retreat back to the jump-off point at Shoop's CP. Seth, it's amazing that this guy has the personal stamina that allows him to continue to fight despite getting a bunch of grenade fragments, penetrating his chest.
Yeah, from all accounts, Hawkins was a man on a mission. I mean, and obviously he had a mission. I'm not trying to be smart aleck here. He was a man on a mission. He was so driven to succeed. He was so driven to not necessarily prove himself. He'd already proved himself multiple times over in training, and he was a born leader. But he was so eager to do his job. His job was to eliminate the enemy, so much so that when he gets back to Shoop's CP, or near that area, a corpsman comes up to treat him. He refuses medical treatment after having his chest shredded by a grenade. He tells his men, quote, "I came here to kill Japs. I didn't come here to be evacuated," end quote. Again, he gets up and leads his team back out to destroy more positions. Absolutely fearless human being here. He again leads every single assault personally from the front as his team knocks out position after position after position. He would low crawl to the Japanese position and either throw grenades in, like you were saying, Bill, or leap up and just shoot the occupants that were in the position. He had a Thompson submachine gun. In his exploits on his second trip, this is after he takes the grenade fragments, Hawk destroys 6 Japanese positions single-handedly, killing an estimated 15 to 20 Japanese by himself. This guy, again, he's not seeking glory. He's not leading these assault charges by himself to, win any personal glory. He's doing this because he's a leader of men. He wants to take the flak for his boys. And that's, in my opinion, that's the ultimate sign of a leader right there. But he ain't done though, Bill.
Yeah. His luck doesn't last forever, unfortunately. Sometime around 10:30, he was hit in the shoulder. The shot severs a main artery, and then the El Paso natives survived the initial shot to be brought back to the aid station, where unfortunately he just bled out. And so he died due to loss of blood. Hawkins' exploits quickly traveled around Betio by word of mouth. Not surprisingly, he would be the second Marine to be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously on Betio. And Robert Sherrod, you remember the reporter, would say of Hawk, to say that his conduct was worthy of the highest traditions of the Marine Corps is like saying the Empire State Building is moderately high. And, Sherrod speaks the truth here. This is one of the bravest actions of the war.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I mean, this guy was an absolute machine, and he was loved. We say this often, good leaders are always loved by their men, and that's the truth. And this is no different. And Hawkins was he was one of those guys that was he was just a really good dude. Not only was he a good leader, he was just a really good man. And not just his people, his scout snipers weren't the only ones that thought very, very highly of him. Basically, anybody that met the man thought very, very highly of him. He was just one of those people that when you meet, you just automatically like the guy. And when you said, Bill, that his word of his exploits traveled around the island, it's because people knew him. Even guys in different regiments, they knew Hawk. They knew who Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins was. So it was a blow.
Seth, maybe take the opportunity to go off script just a little bit and remind folks that we're talking about human beings here, that the Marines and sailors, the corpsmen that are with them, the chaplains and all those other Navy support personnel had a relationship with. And every time you lose one of these guys, every time that guy falls, it has a personal impact on those that survive. And I'm not talking about PTSD at this point, because it's too early for that kind of affliction to, begin manifesting for the folks that are fighting the battle. They're still struggling to survive. So the PTSD hasn't happened yet. It's not post-traumatic yet. But you see somebody that you think so highly of, that you think is better than you, is stronger than you, is braver than you, and they're gone, the psychological impact of that on you, where you say, there's no way I'm going to survive this if they didn't. And that those kinds of thoughts have to have an impact on operational, effectiveness. And again, another part of the leader's job for those leaders that have survived is getting people to put that out of their mind, getting people to move beyond that, trying to get them to forget what just happened. That's in the past. There's nothing we could do about it. We got to continue to move forward, or it's going to happen to us too. And that is not an easy task when you've got an operational mission in parallel with that morale, the moral mission, or the morale boosting mission. To do all those things simultaneously is the only way you can keep the unit effective. And some people are good at the latter and not the former, and some people are good at the former, not the latter. It takes a real leader to be good at both and keep people focused on the mission in front of them and get them to forget what happened to get them to this point. But that's what you got to do. And so, this happens time and time and time again on Betio with every Marine and sailor that falls, Seth.
Yeah, that's a perfect point. And something else too that actions like Hawkins' actions do, especially after he falls, is that will inspire not necessarily a revenge factor, but I mean, yeah, it is kind of a revenge factor. Like, damn it, we're going to pay them back for what they did to that dude. How much, and it's not just Hawkins, obviously, like you said, Bill. I mean, it's the guy sitting next to you. But for somebody who is so well liked, so for someone who is literally known throughout the division, when they hear he's doing this or he does this and then he gets killed, that inspires a certain amount of gusto on the surviving Marines side to avenge that death, to avenge somebody who was so well liked that you went out and had beers with him on Liberty, who was your pal, who gets killed. As what, we're going to make them pay. And that is certainly an aspect that is shown throughout every battle, but especially here at Tarawa, because there were so many guys that had been killed, so many guys that had been wounded, and these men had served, all of them had served together for several months, some of them even more than a year. They literally were brothers. And when one of them goes down, that you do have to put it out of your mind, but that also inspires you to avenge that death. And that's not an uncommon occurrence here at Betio either. Over at Red 3, we talked about Crow having to push through these, I don't want to call them obstacles, although they kind of are, these huge emplacements that are over there at Red 3. He's making some slow gains over there, Major Crow. It's not from lack of desire by any means, and it's not from lack of leadership either. It's from lack of ability to push through these damn things. They're still holding them up. As the advance across the island, as we just said, is making some progress, the advances at Red 3 had kind of run into a stone wall, no pun intended here. Crow's people, try as they may, just could not break through those Japanese defenses. Each Japanese position mutually supported the other. And before Crow could advance, he had to knock these positions out. So, I mean, it's common sense that Japanese are defending each other here in these positions. And in order to knock one out, you got to knock all of them out. You got to, it's like dominoes. You got to take them all out. His men, unfortunately, would knock out smaller positions only to have the positions, quote, come back to life, unquote, with fresh bodies. Or if his Marines attacked a position a second time, the position was seemingly occupied by more defenders. This infuriating, and that had to absolutely light this guy up. We've already talked about Crow. He was a fire eater. He was a go-getter. This had to light him up. Caused him apparently to scream at no one in particular. He says, quote, where in the hell are they coming from? Do they have a tunnel to Tokyo or something, end quote. And it's true. What he did not know is there actually were tunnels around these defenses that the Japanese were able to feed people into. Once these positions are attacked, they would send more men to these positions. Crow had no idea, but he was actually dead on with that assessment. Marines would charge to the front of a position, throwing grenades or even dynamite. retreat and wait for the explosions, and then advance again. Fire would come from the recently attacked position with even more vigor, almost every single time. It soon became clear that each position would have to be completely destroyed via explosive, or each one would have to be injured and the occupants killed to a man, often in hand-to-hand combat. Flamethrowers, noticeably absent on D-Day, soon become Jim Crow's best friend, Bill.
Yeah. And, they're going to be used throughout the day. The problem with flamethrowers, though, is there's fuel tanks on your back eventually run out when you're clearing a bunch of defensive positions like this. And so you got to ditch it or get another one or refuel it, which isn't easy. And that brings us to the story of Private First Class Robert Molbach of 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. And he said of clearing the Japanese out, it was a lot of bayoneting. You want to get in deep inside. You want to get that bayonet in deep inside to make sure it was a kill. So you get it in there and you wiggle it around a bit and then extract it. That's an end quote there, but Molbach often had to fend off a second occupant with his knife while he's bayoneting the first guy. And he says, you hold on to the rifle, and as soon as you got a chance to do it, you kick the body and pull on the bayonet. Pull on the bayonet, pull it out, and then put it in the next guy. You're in a fight, like a fight in a ring between two boxers. You're trying to find that outlet to kill the other guy. I don't know how many men I killed during those 3 days. Who counts? A lot of them, you didn't know if they died or not. You hit them, you don't know if they're dead. I damn sure didn't go over and ask them, end quote. And Seth, at some point here, after all of this, the tide does seem to turn a bit.
It does, and the fighting. We talked a bit about this on D-Day, and it's no different here on day 2 and even day 3. The fighting was so close here, and that's when we wanted to include that quote from Molbach about bayoneting the Japanese, not to be gory or to be whatever. The fighting was so close combat, it was so visceral that it was like that all over the island, literally all over the island. But to your point, Bill, things do start to turn. We talked about Major Ryan's attack over at Red 1 kicking off a little after 11 o'clock that morning. Well, and then of course, the attack at Red 2 just punching right through the Japanese lines and running across the island. Things do start to Marines are noticing things are going a little bit easier as the day is going along. Reinforcements are coming ashore at varying times throughout the day. Elements of the 8th Marines and finally the 6th Marines that we talked about slosh ashore. The 1st Regiment of the 8th Marines landed at Red 2. Now, even though that Major Ryan had directed or requested that all reinforcements go to Green Beach, which, by the way, Colonel Shoup second, he's like, yep, okay, this is undefended, said everybody to Green Beach. For whatever reason, some of these Marines start to slosh ashore at Red 2. Now, if you remember, the Japanese are still entrenched at Red 2. The first Battalion of the 8th Marines lands at Red 2, and as they waded ashore from their LCVPs, remember the reef, they got to wade ashore 500 to 600 yards or 700 yards. They're taken under fire from Japanese still holed up in what is now called the pocket on Red 2. Bill, you can highlight the pocket right there. There it is, right there. Mm-hmm. Try as they may, the Marines that were at Red 2 could not knock out this pocket. This is similar to what's going on at Red 3, in that the Japanese are in these coconut log and sometimes concrete defensive positions, and the Marines can't get them out. They can't get them out of there. They can't destroy these positions. It's literally running into a stone wall over and over again. So the Marines that are sloshing ashore at Red 2, despite Shoup's request that they be put in at Green Beach, are being machine gunned in the water, just like the guys that that sloshed ashore on D-Day 24 hours before. And again, you got to sit there and scratch your head and wonder what in the hell is going on. You have an undefended beach. You're landing people at this beach, and they're walking ashore untouched, and yet you send guys in at Red 2, and they're getting hammered. They're just getting absolutely hammered. Yeah.
Then you got this guy named Major Ryan, who's over at Red 1, of course, and in Sanford's F Company at Red 2. they finally meet each other and close the gap in their lines, which on D-Day that night had been like 650 yards or something like that. Save for the pocket, Red 1 and Red 2 are now clear of Japanese. So some progress is being made. The dramatic gains could literally be felt by those ashore. Most of those who survived, for whatever reason, pin that time around noon on day 2, where everybody kind of, concurs that that's when they felt a little tiny bit of momentum. For whatever reason, that momentum shifted, but until that time, even Shoup admitted that until then it was touch and go. After that, after noonish on day 2, Shoup says, "I knew that we would win." So many Marines noted that as they began to move through the Japanese defenses, they started noticing many of the Riko Sentai, those are the sailors, had committed suicide. As many as 17 had been counted in one position, all dead from self-inflicted wounds. Colonel Shoup took these reports as a sign that the Japanese will is being broken. This news encouraged Shoup to send a message to General Julian Smith that read, "Casualties many, percentage dead unknown, combat efficiency, we are winning," unquote. Pretty good message, Seth.
Indeed, and that certainly lifted the spirits. And again, like you said, Bill, nobody really knows why at that time that the Japanese did start to break, and they could feel that the Marines ashore could literally feel the momentum shifting there. It's kind of like a football game. You don't necessarily know why it happens, but you can feel it when it does happen. And this is huge. Day 2 ashore ends. This is this is really the only fighting that goes on day 2 is Ryan's advance, that push across the airfield at Red 2. And then Crow is still stymied at Red 3, just bashing his head against this concrete wall. Day 2 ashore ends with the Marines having captured the entirety of the western half of Betio. The only Japanese threat from the eastern edge of Red 2 was the pocket that we just talked about, still stubbornly holding out. I've never been able to find exactly how many Japanese were in the pocket, but apparently it was a pretty good size amount, because these people held out till the bitter end. Major Crow at Red 3 still faced the massive concrete blockhouse fortifications that he had yet to punch through. Now, though the Marines had cut the fortification off, these are the fortifications at Red 3, they had yet to reduce it. That would come on day 3. Norman Hatch, my old buddy, Major Chamberlain, and a man named Bonnyman would see to that, Bill. Day 3, as the sun rises on Betio on that third day, Robert Sherrod, and we are always asked about books, like what books to read, for these specific battles. And there are a ton of books that have been written about Tarawa, but there are really 3 that really are really, really good ones. One of them was written by Robert Sherrod back in 1943, and it's called simply Tarawa. It's very difficult to find. My copy is about 80 years old. But if you can somehow lay your hands on it, read it. It is absolutely fantastic. Sherrod was there from D-Day on, and his writing is poetic. It's beautiful, it's truthful, and it's accurate. It's 100% accurate. You need to read it. Robert Sherrod himself on day 3, as the sun is rising, is walking behind the beaches. He peers into the surf from the Japanese perspectives. Now, he's in the knocked out Japanese positions, and he's looking towards where the Marines had come ashore on D-Day. He absolutely marveled that any Americans had been able to actually land. Enemy positions dotted the landscape every 5 to 10 yards along the water's edge. Their charred or destroyed remains somber reminders of the cost that had been paid that D-Day morning. One of the sights that greeted Sherrod was a pile of 4 dead Japanese lying in grotesque positions. Right next to them were the 2 Marines that killed them and had gotten killed in turn. He somberly reflected that the sight he was looking at was why the Marines would finish this action this third day. He later wrote, quote, "They also gave their lives for 130 million other Americans who realize it, I fear, only dimly," end quote. It's not untrue in any other war, Bill. And we'll get to the home front here in just a few minutes. But Bill, it looked like Betio on the third day was not a pretty place to be, was it? It didn't look like the tropical paradise.
Bodies, both Marine and Japanese, littered the landscape literally everywhere. The equatorial sun began to bloat. Again, we're not trying to be grotesque here, but again,
Sure.
you've got to imagine what it was like, because that these Marines still had to fight in this environment where bodies were bloating, the dead to the state of them looking like reddened or blackened balloons ready to pop. There simply had not been time to clear out the dead. Marine John Magruder later wrote about the dead. There was one stretch of beach where every foot of barbed wire was literally draped with dead Marines who had been caught trying to force their way over it. Tarawa was a stinking Golgotha, littered with destruction from one end to the other. A correspondent wrote, the smell was inescapable. It was everywhere, and is not the kind of smell one gets accustomed to. It suffused the Marines' hair, their clothing, and adhered to their bodies. They smelled like it for weeks after the battle. Betio was nothing but stink and death, Seth.
Yeah, this was hell on earth for anyone who was lucky enough to survive it at this point in the battle. And now we need to step back a couple of hours, Bill. At the end of day 2, one of my personal heroes comes ashore, Colonel Red Mike Edson. Edson arrived on site to take over for Shoup, as had been prearranged. Now, Shoup had done nothing wrong. This is not to say Edson came in and relieved him, although he did. He came in and relieved him because that had actually been prearranged. So let's be abundantly clear here. Merritt Edson didn't come ashore because Shoup was doing a bad job. This is something that had been set up before. Shoup stayed ashore. He stayed ashore and kind of got Edson situated and said, look, this is what's going on. This is literally the up to the minute reports. But typical of Red Mike, as soon as he comes ashore, after listening to Shoup, he says, great, thanks. Here's what we're going to do. His orders for day 3 were essentially finish this fight today. Get this over with, get this done. It is time. We need to get out of here. The 6 Marines would pass through Major Ryan's men and would attack eastwards along Betio's southern shore. They would then, these 6 Marines, these are the guys that came ashore at Green Beach, would pass through Sanford's F Company that Bill talked about just a little while ago and take the lead, pushing all the way down the Bird's Tail. And I say the Bird's Tail. If you're looking at the map that Bill's got on the screen right now, if you look at Betio, it looks like a bird. And their job is to push just where Bill had that red line right there, bam, all the way down through the end of the island. Crow was to finish the concrete fortifications, and the pocket would be eliminated by 1-8 and Ryan's men from Red 1. So the pocket was going to be eliminated today, hell or high water, according to Red Mike Edson, and Major Crow is going to knock these positions out at Red 3. Additional supplies had poured ashore during the night at Green Beach. For the first time, albeit late, flamethrowers were present in abundance. More tanks arrived, as did armored 75 millimeter wielding half tracks. These are going to be used, these tanks, these are 75 millimeter wielding half tracks are going to be used to knock out these positions that seemingly can't be killed. The push from Betio's center advanced steadily. The Marines are crushing opposition along the way. The defenses, however, were not to be taken lightly. Every 100 yards were at least 6, this is a Marine's estimate after the battle, says that every 100 yards were at least 6 Japanese machine gun bunkers that all mutually supported one another. Faced with having to go straight at them, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines did that very thing, Bill. Their fighting lasts about 3 hours, but they make some significant gains, don't they?
And they do. 1-8 advanced about 800 yards as the Japanese began to crumble. Casualties were light for 1-8, while they killed an estimated 300 Japanese. We're going to go through the grand total later in this episode, but it's starting to get uneven casualties only at this point in the battle. Major Thomas Colhane, regimental ops officer, was heard to yell, "We got him by the balls now, boys." And that brings us to the story of Alexander Bonnyman, Seth.
Yeah, and we're gonna do something as we get along in the story here. I've got footage that I want to show everybody, and I could interlay it. I could lay it into the finished product here, but we want to do it live because you're going to really dig on this as we go through. So stand by for that in just a minute. Back to the story, Bill, as we were talking about. Over at Red 3, Crow assigns trusty Major William Chamberlain. We talked about this guy on D-Day. This guy is a freaking badass. Yeah, yes, yeah. The college professor. He assigns Major Chamberlain, this is the XO, this is Crow's XO, of killing the 3 fortifications that had so stalled the assault to this point. 2 of the 3 were killed by Chamberlain's leadership. Well, they weren't killed by Chamberlain alone. They were killed by Chamberlain's assault in about 2 hours with the flamethrowers that had been so desperately needed on D-Day. Chamberlain was helped by mortars, naval gunfire, and tanks as his advance slowly churns forward. This is a shot in a million here. A lucky mortar hit on an ammo bunker erupted in flame and shrapnel that wound up helping to knock out one position that Chamberlain had been going out. So they hit this ammo bunker and it just eviscerates this one position that Chamberlain was going after. And, he had to say, well, thanks. I appreciate that. That helped out quite nicely. So with 2 of the 3 knocked out, Bill, or 2 of the 3 down, that leaves the toughest one. And this toughest one is this huge concrete bunker. And I'm talking huge. I'm talking like this thing was built up. It was about 2 stories tall, and it's surrounded by piled sand. So it looks like a hill, because it actually is a hill, but in the inside of that hill is this concrete bunker. This thing was blockhouses, what Chamberlain calls it, is impervious to naval gunfire. It's impervious to aerial bombing. It's impervious to everything except for flamethrowers and gasoline and dynamite, if you can get close enough to deploy those weapons, Bill. So this thing is proving to be a tough nut to crack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember, and again, jumping ahead, that after the battle, when Nimitz tours Betio, that he kind of walks right by this place. And I think there's photographs of him in front of this. And if I'm not mistaken, the elements of that blockhouse bunker still exist today. If one were to tour Betio, they could see how robust this place is. But it acted like a bomb-proof shelter, and Crow orders his riflemen to pin down the Japanese on top of it, so that the Browning automatic riflemen, engineers, and flamethrower men could creep up to it, to the top, and kill whatever remained up there. Once that was done, so the people on top of the bunker were dead, then the engineers would pour gasoline down the air vents and would set the whole place off with one big boom. Those who survived would come out into the open, where the Marines were prepared and positioned to cut them down. The entire attack up the hill, at the top, the attack on the top of the bunker, and down again would be under enemy fire. Norm Hatch is there. Remember the civilian? Yeah, I think he was a civilian, or was he a Marine?
No, he was a Marine. He was a Marine.
He's a Marine, okay. But he's there to report. He's not an infantryman, as I recall, right?
Right.
So he's there, and he's invited by Chamberlain to come along, saying, you ought to be able to get good pictures of this attack. Mm-hmm. So at 0900, Chamberlain rushes forward to initiate the attack. Hatch and his aide, Kelleher, are right beside him. The trio surprise the Japanese, making it all the way to the top of the bunker without taking fire. They reach the top. Chamberlain looks around and realizes that he, Hatch, and Kelleher are the only ones who jumped up and moved. All the other Marines are still down below. He looks at Norm in astonishment and asks simply, what the hell just happened? And Norm looks below and sees Japanese looking straight up at him. He says to Chamberlain, we need to get the hell out of here. And the trio runs back down the hill back to the Marine lines, Seth.
Yeah. Chamberlain relays his orders to his men, and they just don't move. They just don't go. The only ones that follow him are the 2 cameramen, Marine Corps cameramen, Hatch and Kelleher. Now, Norm told me he recalled that Chamberlain gets back down to back to the starting point, to the kickoff point, and he is furious. He's literally shaking with rage. He yells at his men, quote, now we're going to go take that goddamn thing, and all you, and I'm going to bleep myself out, mother effers, are going to come with me, unquote. So Chamberlain was a little hot under the collar that really, and if you
blame
think
them?
about it, no, absolutely, hell no. But if you think about it, Bill, this is that could have saved a lot of lives. You know, if guys had gotten up there and just gone with him at that moment, they wouldn't have met any, or they would have met return fire. But at that point, they could have knocked out a lot of Japanese there.
Yeah, they took them by surprise, and you could
Yeah.
only do that once.
Exactly.
You only get that opportunity one time, and it was wasted in this case. So pausing, he goes to Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman. This is the subject of this bit of news here, an engineer, and told him to be right behind him on the way up. When he would reach the top, Bonnyman and the engineers were supposed to destroy the blockhouse from the top with grenades and flamethrowers. Bonnyman shook his head yes, and a minute later, Chamberlain shouted, "Go." Chamberlain, Hatch, Kelleher, Bonnyman, and 40 others this time get up and scale the slopes, but now under intense Japanese fire. Chamberlain stops at a fence that ran perpendicular to the crest and directs the attack as Bonnyman now took the lead. As they drew closer to the top, the enemy fire increased. Bonnyman, oblivious to the threat, repeatedly stood up to signal to Chamberlain and had the supporting machine gun fire shifted higher up the slope as they advance up the slope. As the team drew closer, Bonnyman instructs a flamethrower man named Corporal Boric to roast the Japanese on the left side of the crest in a machine gun bunker. Boric reaches the top, releases a short blast of flame at the gunner, then a longer one to cover fellow Marines' approach right behind his flames as that Marine Corporal Niehoff throws a short fused block of TNT. And what happens then, Seth?
So the TNT's explosion, and we're going to show all this in a minute. And this is why we're going to kind of step out of context here for a second. If you recall what Bill just said, Norm Hatch, you know, he's a Marine Corps cameraman. He's there to record this. He's invited by Chamberlain to record this attack. And that's exactly what Norm is doing as all this is going on. And, you know, there's now, we know of at least one other that we know of footage of a Medal of Honor action, and that's the footage from Afghanistan that was shot from the drone, and I cannot remember the gentleman's name. The only other footage that we know of a Medal of Honor action is the footage that I'm going to show you guys here in just a minute that was shot by Norm Hatch of Alexander Bonnyman. Now, back to the action before we show the footage. The TNT's explosion that Niehoff throws distracts the Japanese long enough for the Marines to tackle the air vents of the structure. Boric empties his flamethrower against the last machine gunner, while Bonnyman and Niehoff take positions at the top of the structure to cover the men coming up the hill behind them. Seemingly sensing their demise, the Japanese pour out of the blockhouse and they ran straight into the Marines. And in the footage you'll see, and we'll go through it here step by step in just a second, you don't see the Japanese come out of this blockhouse because of where Norm is, but you do see the Marines that are on the right-hand side that are just pouring fire down into these people as they're coming out of here. The short, furious fight was cut even shorter when the accompanying tank Colorado fires a canister round into the fleeing enemy. At this point, Bonnyman raises up on one elbow to yell for more demolition charges, and when he does, he is shot and killed, unfortunately. Marines swarmed up the crest of the hill, killing the fleeing Japanese as they ran out of the blockhouse. For his efforts, Bonnyman would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. With the reduction of this friggin' blockhouse, Crow and Chamberlain now had a clear path to the airfield, which they immediately exploited. But let's get to the footage, Bill. I'm going to try and share my screen here, so bear with me, guys. All right, here we go.
Yep, we see it.
This is, you got me? Okay, cool. This is the footage that was shot by Norm Hatch of this attack. Oops, good gravy. There we go. This is the footage that was shot by Hatch. I'm going to go through it in very slow motion here, as you see. This is the side of the hill over here where the attack is beginning to prepare. This is just Bonnyman and his people are over here. They're off camera. They're on this side right here. These Marines are moving forward. They're starting to gather their supplies. These guys have been identified as engineers. They are basically grabbing TNT. They're getting ready to go up there and go blow the living hell out of this bunker. The footage does jump around, so bear with me here. Now, this is the assault. This is Bonnyman's assault as it's moving up. Chamberlain is, you can see right here, this is not Chamberlain. However, this is part of the fence that Bill said runs perpendicular. Chamberlain is right about over here behind this fence. Look at the knocked out LVT1 right here, as a matter of fact. The Marines are going up through here. The man in the lead, who you cannot see because he's behind a tree over here, is Alexander Bonnyman. This is his assault team going up the hill right now. See this gentleman here is armed with an M1 carbine. This guy, this is Alexander Bonnyman right here. Bonnyman's very easy to identify in this footage and any other pictures you see of Red 3 because he's not wearing a helmet cover. He's an engineer. Most of the Marines that are assaulting this position, even guys in his assault group, have helmet covers. For whatever reason, Alexander Bonnyman does not have a Marine Corps helmet cover on his helmet, so his helmet is naked the entire time, so he's pretty easy to identify. He's also carrying an M1 carbine, which this gentleman right here is doing. So this is Bonnyman right here. You can see very clearly there is no helmet cover on there. You can see his M1 carbine right here. He's giving instructions to the Marines behind him back here. So we're going to advance this slowly. Of course, unfortunately, he's behind this damn tree. But as we're going up here, this is Bonnyman here. This is Borich here. Yeah, this is Borich with the flamethrower. This is Niehoff here. And you can see them working their way up. There are Marines here. There are Marines that are also working their way up the hill on this side. They're out of frame, but you can't see them, but they're working their way up the hill on this side. So the fire is coming this way, and it's coming this way. You see him getting up. This is Bonnyman. You can see him directing the attack. He's bringing these men forward. You can see the rifle here. You can see the flamethrower here. We're going to advance it a little bit quicker here. So this is the first shot. This is where Borich, there's a Japanese machine gunner literally right here. Borich sees him. Bonnyman sees him at the same time. Bonnyman instructs him to roast and, literally roast the man on the other side. Borich responds, boom. That flame licks the top of this guy's head, which is literally right here. Kills that Japanese machine gunner, and he hits another burst right here. So this is exactly what Bill was talking about. Let me refer to the notes here. Corporal Borich to roast the Japanese on the left side of the crest in a machine gun bunker. That is what you just witnessed right there. They're moving up again. You see Borich rise up again to fire. This is the second shot that he's instructed. Here's Bonnyman right here. Bonnyman's yelling at Marines that are working their way up the hill right here. Here goes Borich. About to light him up again, maybe. There he goes. That's to knock out the rest of the Japanese that are in that machine gun position right there. And it does. And if you look right here, you see a hand go up. This is Niehoff right here. Borich is here. He just fired his flamethrower. Bonnyman's here. Niehoff is here. You watch, he throws the TNT charge. There it goes on the other side of the crest. Now watch this. This is a hell of an explosion. This isn't a grenade. Give it a minute. Boom. That's a big one. That is nothing but straight up TNT. Again, Alexander Bonnyman here directing this assault. He's right here. He's crouching now. There's another machine gun bunker over here. These things here are the air vents that they were instructed to pour the fuel down to blow the hell out of the guys that were inside this bunker. They're now starting to take, I'm sorry, I'm sitting here pointing with my finger, not that you can see it, but they're now starting to take pretty significant fire. The Marines have been stalled on this side of the hill. The Japanese over here that Borich just fired his flamethrower at, there's some that are retaking this position to open fire on Bonnyman's men as they're coming up. So they're starting to pull back and take cover. Bonnyman's over here yelling at people to move up. Here he is again. I mean, again, look at this guy standing straight up in the middle of all this fire. And right around here is where Norm's film, I don't know if it just got overexposed or if it got too hot or what, but it starts to go white, as you can see clearly. And we lose sight of Bonnyman briefly. And unfortunately, well, I guess maybe fortunately so, at that point, he is hit. At that point, somewhere in this whitewash of film footage, Alexander Bonnyman gets hit and gets killed. This is presumably him right here at the top of the hill. I don't know for sure, but that's where accounts put him. and then he kind of disappears. So these are the Marines that have been steadily working their way up on the other side of the hill. The Japanese are now pouring out of the side of the bunker, and you can see these Marines are just lighting them up. They're just absolutely lighting these guys up, throwing grenades, throwing demo charges. Here comes a flamethrower man. Somewhere in this pile back here is, over here to the left is Alexander Bonnyman's body. When he gets hit, he starts to slide down the side of the hill after he gets, and he's hit and he's immediately killed. He starts to slide down the side of the hill. And apparently a lot of these Marines witnessed this, and they start to rush over to that side later on in the film footage. You actually can't really see it very well. They run over there to keep him from falling all the way down the hill. They knew he was dead, but they didn't want him to go all the way down the bottom of the hill. There's one other photograph I want to show. Bear with me here. This picture here was taken by Kelleher. That gentleman right there, that's Norm Hatch. You can see how close Norm was. And if you look at the air vents, look at the bullet holes in these damn things. They look like Swiss cheese, but that's Norm Hatch. You can see how close Norm was to the actual fighting here. This is a still shot by Kelleher here. This is Bonnyman right there. So you can see the Marines have made their way up the hill. This is Niehoff right here. This is shortly before he gets killed in action. I'm going to stop my screen share and go back to, so bear with me here again. All right, how are we looking, Bill? We looking good?
Yep. I see you again. Yeah, so it's a fascinating piece of footage, Seth.
Yeah.
You know, on one hand, you wish more of that kind of thing existed, because it would more clearly give credence to what people say about this battle. On the other hand, maybe it's a good thing that it doesn't, because of the horror that it would reveal. In this case, I would say, you know, it was important to go through that bit of footage, you know, almost frame by frame the way we did. We can't do that with every bit of footage that exists for the Pacific War, or this podcast would last 20 years. But there are a few bits like that that I think over the course of season 3, you're going to be seeing us do that with, because I think it does help explain it as we reveal it. Now, the folks that are listening to the audio of this podcast are going to wonder what the heck all that was about. Seth's descriptions did a good job of describing silly language there, but you know what we were witnessing, what we were watching, and hopefully you can go back and watch the YouTube version of it to see the footage yourself, because it is absolutely gripping, better than any Hollywood movie could ever be made.
It is, you know, and to your point, Bill, that kind of footage, not that footage is rare. I mean, Norm Hatch shot, I forget how many cans of footage. He shot a ton of it, but that's aside from what we mentioned about the Medal of Honor action in Afghanistan that was shot by a drone, that you can kind of see the outline of the gentleman doing his deeds. You can clearly see Alexander Bonnyman here, and if you look at pictures of him, that there's a couple that were taken of him on the beach before he does this. You can see the outfit that he's wearing, the uniform and the way, no helmet cover. It's pretty obvious that it's him, and there is no doubt that that was him. And I felt that, or we felt that by describing it, with sharing the screen and doing that, you know, describing it as we did, that it was going to come across a little better than by me just showing it as we were describing the action. Because for those who did not know what Bonnyman was wearing or what he looked like, you know, it's just some dude moving up a hill. You don't know that that is a future Medal of Honor recipient. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So after this blockhouse is finally mercifully reduced, the battle is not over by any means. However, that's kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, because now Crow can finally punch through these positions, meet up with the Marines, the 6 Marines that had come ashore at Green, that had pushed their way through Ryan, that had pushed their way through Sanford, and now they're forming one cohesive front along the length of Betio, which had until this time had yet to happen. By dusk, the Marines had clearly seized the upper hand on Betio. Japanese defenders, for the most part, opted to kill themselves all over the island. The Marines had pushed what remained of the Rico Sentai to the bird's tail and had clawed most of the Japanese out of the pocket at Red 2. Believe it or not, these damn people are still holding out this friggin' thing. The much anticipated Japanese counterattack that had been so feared on D-Day night finally comes on the night of November 22nd and 23rd. What began as a series of organized assaults against Marine lines quickly divulged into a melee. Now, the Japanese, and you're going to hear this again as we go through some of these battles that we're going to get into in 1944, specifically Saipan. The Japanese, once they realize that, this ain't working out, all hope is lost, they kind of throw caution. Well, they throw caution to the wind, and they do start to mount some of these large scale bonsai suicide charges because they're not going to surrender. A series of 4 Japanese counterattacks were launched at elements of the 6th Marines. With fixed bayonets, the Japanese came charging at the Marines, who cut them down. After the initial assault, Marine artillery began dropping on the gathering Japanese, who had then had to run through a 500-yard long artillery curtain before they even reached the 6th Marines lines. Bill, there's not going to be a lot of guys that are going to make their way through that.
No, not at all. And just again, to push this out, we're talking about this element right here, the 6th are in here. This is the tail the Japanese had been pushed into, and they counterattacked that way to the 6th Marine lines. So naturally, some of the Japanese do make it through the Marine lines, where the fighting devolves into primal hand-to-hand combat again, as had everything else on Betio. The Japanese drove a wedge between A and B companies, forcing the Marines to hastily assemble a response force consisting of cooks and artillerymen. A mortar platoon commanded by Captain Lyle Spreck fixed bayonets and charged at the charging Japanese. Yep. So it's kind of, give some of your own medicine. The mortar platoon's charge took the starch out of the Japanese charge, the Japanese charge's dying moments, and the mortarmen bayoneted and shot what remained. Piles of Japanese 4 and 5 high greeted the mortarmen as they closed the gap between A and B companies. 2 more assaults came at the Marines as the Japanese wore themselves out against the Marine lines. Despite being short on ammunition by this point and having many wounded, the Marines of A and B companies held the line for the remainder of the night. The following morning, some of the wounded passed by Robert Sherrod and said, "They told us we had to hold, and by God, we held," Seth.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did. And that's the kind of the last gasp of the fighting on Betio. The nocturnal assaults by the Japanese on the night of the 22nd and 23rd is pretty much it. It's not completely over, but for the most part, it is. By the early afternoon of November 23rd, all remaining Japanese opposition had been eliminated, and finally, the guns on Betio fall silent. At roughly the same time, ironically enough, a Navy F-6F Hellcat landed at newly christened Hawkins Field in honor of William Dean Hawkins. Jubilant Marines greet this pilot. There is footage shot by Norm Hatch's shot by Norm Hatch's cameraman of this F-6F landing on Hawkins Field. At 13:05, General Julian Smith messaged Admiral Hattery Hill saying, quote, "Betio has fallen," unquote. After 76 hours of non-stop combat, the battle is finally over. On November 24th, Bill, Old Glory is raised on a coconut tree trunk.
Yeah, it's incredible. And after 76 hours of the bloodiest combat yet fought by Marines, or yet seen by American eyes, Tarawa was mercifully over. The casualties on both sides were shocking. The Americans suffered over 3,400 casualties. That includes 1,000 fatalities. The numbers don't tell the story, though. The Marines lost a similar number at Guadalcanal. But that campaign was 6 months long. Tarawa was 76 hours long. The sheer number of casualties in such a short amount of time was and still is mind-boggling. Of the over 4,600 Japanese on the island of Betio, only 17 were captured. The rest of them were killed. Once news broke in the US of the casualties suffered on Tarawa, the public reaction was, shall we say, appalled. Newspapers blasted the headlines of heavy casualties all across the country, with many questioning why such a small island, seemingly in the middle of nowhere, could cost the amount of lives that it did. Some members of Congress, of course, demanded a special investigation, as often happens by political folks. Bad press seemed everywhere, so much so that Merritt Edson was sent home to speak on behalf of the Marine Corps, the 2nd Marine Division, and the war effort in general. Edson, genuinely recognized hero at this point, seemed to quell some of the ill talk, yet the specter of Tarawa loomed throughout the rest of the war. The public, as we said, was shocked at the initial casualty reports. Seemingly living in a blinded world, most Americans seem to ignore the fact that war costs lives and that people die in wars. It was somewhat antiseptic for most of the public back home, Seth, until the great reveal occurred for the folks back home. And how did that happen, Seth?
Yeah, well, there were several great reveals, as you say, and I want to touch on this for a minute. We've not talked about the home front for obvious reasons. This is a Pacific War podcast. This is the home front podcast, although it is important to recognize aspects of the home front as they come along throughout the Pacific War. And this is one of those times. This is November 1943, late November at this point, frankly, early December 1943. So this is 2 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And American tenacity on the home front was starting to wane. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt could sense that. And what you have to, the viewer and the listener have to understand, there's a lot of propaganda that's going, and that's what it is, that's going out in 80 years that said, we're all in this together. And that's a crock. The American home front, for the most part, people who lived in the American continental 48 during the war, unless they had someone overseas, were virtually untouched by the war. There was rationing, obviously. There were people that, women who went to work for the first time and things like that absolutely did occur. However, there was an enormous black market in the United States too. And it was not necessarily that hard to get the meat that was so rationed. I mean, I'm just going to put that out there too, and it did put a hit on things, but for the most part, the civilian life in the United States in 1943 wasn't much different than it was on December 6, 1941. It had not changed all that much. People in this country were still living as they had, for the most part, before the war. And, the Marines and the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen on both sides of the globe, in the European theater and the Pacific, were fighting a war that, unless you had a loved one over there, unless you were a returning veteran, was an alien world to the American home front. And that's why works like Sherrod's Tarawa and Norm Hatch's With the Marines at Tarawa, and we're going to get to that in a minute, were so very important. After Tarawa, or because of Tarawa, this aspect of living in a dream world changed for a lot of the American public. The images of the Marine dead that were sprawled all over Betio's bloody beaches absolutely floored Americans. This is not the first time that dead Americans had been shown to the American public. There was a place, we did an episode on Boona Gona. There was a place on Boona called Maggot Beach, and it wasn't just called Maggot Beach because it was a funny name, there were dead all over the beach, including United States Army soldiers who were infested with maggots, hence the name. There were photographs that were taken of this that only showed the backs of these soldiers. It didn't show any faces. It didn't show any blood or gore. They were just dead men lying in the sand. And this was shown, I believe, in Life magazine, but I could be wrong. And that kind of sent a little bit of a shockwave to the American public. But in those photographs, there's only 2 or 3 dead soldiers in there. The footage that Norm had shot, the pictures that Kelleher took of the literally stacks of bodies, bloody, horrible, dismembered, gory bodies of Marines floating in the water, laying on the beach, just sent shockwaves through the American public. Before With the Marines at Tarawa was released, which of course is the documentary that was made from Norm Hatch and Kelleher's footage, it had to be passed by President Roosevelt. It was brought to him and said, look, this is some pretty nasty stuff. Do you really want to show this to the American public? He watched it and said, yeah, they need to see it. And the reason for that was he felt that the sense of sacrifice that had flooded the country after Pearl Harbor had subsided, and it had. And something had to be done to raise awareness that the war was not an easy task, that it would be a long and bloody war, and sacrifices would have to be made. Robert Sherrod, who'd been with the Marines on Betio step for step, wrote for Time magazine. He wasn't just some random writer. His poetic prose, after he gets back to Hawaii, he's immediately banging on that typewriter and graced the pages of Time magazine and allowed Americans really for the first time to read exactly what the war was really like in the Pacific. His book that we talked about, entitled Tarawa, did much the same, but with more detail. Bill, my old buddy Norm Hatch shot the majority of the film on Tarawa, not all of it. There was a guy named Billy Kelleher who shot most of the still imagery, and there was another Marine still image photographer, and damn it, I forgot his name.
John Ercole.
Ercole was the guy that shot. So you'll see two versions of Betio's footage. There's black and white footage and there's color footage. Norm shot all the black and white footage. Ercole shot all the color footage. I remember Norm saying that. Yeah, he told me that very thing. But this quadruple set of Marines, and forgive me for forgetting the other man's name, I'm going to put it in the video after we say this. This helped change a lot of the perception of the war on the American side, didn't it, Bill?
Yeah, it did. And again, FDR thought this was going to be a necessary awakening of the American public. Some of this video was included in movie tone news. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with how video news got out in these days, there was no television. So there wasn't any nightly news with Walter Cronkite or anything like there was during the Vietnam War. What happened was the news footage would be presented before cinema, movies. So people would go to the theater and they would watch news reels, and before the movie that they paid to see would be shown. And so for the first time, I think, at least in a significant, amount, video news footage, film footage, was presented to the American public before the movie that included this kind of very raw footage. And, it was one of those things that had a very significant impact on the American public. Tarawa's success proved that amphibious invasions against well-defended beaches could and did work. However, there's going to be a very high price for landing on a defended beach. It showed that the Navy's plan for working their way across the Pacific, as outlined in War Plan Orange and modified since, would indeed be the blueprint with which the war would be fought and won against Japan. Betio's airfield, the ultimate prize, would serve its purpose and fly airplanes to the next step in the road to Tokyo, which was the Marshall Islands. And as I said earlier, Nimitz toured Betio not long after its capture. Nimitz commented on the stench. So that still existed when he went ashore, and remarking on the stoutness of defenses, Nimitz ordered that the naval engineers make drawings of Betio's defenses. And from those drawings, exact replicas of Betio's defenses were built on the Hawaiian island of Kaho'olawe, which was used for bombardment practice and things like that. And that island and those defenses were used to rehearse effective shore bombardment against the kind of defenses the Japanese had built on Betio that we assumed would be used for the remainder of the war. So as part of the rehearsal for how to bombard in preparation for amphibious landings, ships would go to Kaho'olawe and they would practice that bombardment to improve upon the defenses. And the other thing is we figured out that those 3 hours of bombardment, which was advertised before the landings at Betio to be the most profound bombardment in the history of warfare, was nowhere near enough. Remember, we feared that the Marines would get sunk by the combined fleet in their shipping before they had an opportunity to get ashore. So we shortened the bombardment to get the Marines ashore, thinking that they were at greater risk on the ships than they were on the beaches. Well, that turned out not to be true. So combined fleet be damned, we were going to bombard for days or even weeks of pre-invasion bombardment before we can do what we would need to do.
So, yeah, I mean, we stressed this at the beginning that Tarawa was so vitally important to the war effort, or Tarawa Betio, as what we've been calling, was so vitally important to the war effort because it influenced everything that happened after it. And it even has far-reaching effects into today, Bill. So the Navy concluded, because of the reef issue at Betio, the Navy concluded that some sort of demolition team had to be created so as to deal with the coral reefs that the Navy would certainly encounter again on its tour, quote, across the Pacific. To that end, the Navy Underwater Demolition Teams, or UDTs, were formed. These teams, forerunners to today's Navy SEALs, and called frogmen in their day, would destroy reefs that blocked invasion routes. They would secure beach information such as tides, obstacles, and other assorted vital bits of information as the Marines and later soldiers are going to land on these coral atolls. They'd also secure weather patterns and generally obtain accurate vital intelligence in the hours before, or even sometimes weeks before, an invasion. Speaking of tides, let's just put the myth to death right now. There's a myth still out today that because of the low tides, Marines were killed in greater numbers than would have happened had the tides been higher. That is completely untrue, because if you look at some footage or pictures of Betio as the tide is coming in, that tide washes up against that seawall. Again, we said in the first episode in this little series that there's a seawall there for a reason, is to block the sea. That if that tide would have been in, if the tide would have been high, those LCVPs, yes, they would have cleared that reef. Yes, they would have made it to the shore and landed directly in front of Japanese machine gun positions. So while that harrowing 500 to 700 yards slosh through machine gun fire certainly cut down a lot of Marines, God bless them, the casualties, it's almost undeniable. It is undeniable, would have been higher had they landed directly on that seawall. They wouldn't have had anywhere to go. They'd have had literally no cover at all. It would have been even worse than it actually was at Betio. And, that's important that people, that was a big thing after Betio, that, the tides are what caused it. And then and all this because of the tides. The tides certainly caused a lot of death, but had the tide been in, it would have been even worse. And again, that is undeniable.
And if I could put my spin on what you just said, Seth, the surprise of the tides was inexcusable. We should have known.
Sure.
And that's why the SEALs were created. The frogmen were created. By the way, SEALs today call themselves frogmen too. So that we could survey the beach before the landing and we won't be surprised by what we encounter there. And the second point is, yep, as you said, people died, Marines died, sailors died in wading ashore. There's no doubt about that. The issue is that the number that were killed from that activity, sadly, was dwarfed by the number who were killed ashore. And so,
It's true.
yeah, it's sad that people were killed coming ashore, but far greater numbers were killed ashore. And the battle ashore was really what could have gone better. If we could have fixed something, it would have been our effectiveness once we landed, rather than, we would have loved to have fixed everything, I should say. But
Sure.
It's not the fact that the LVTs got hung on the reef was not the determining factor on the number of Marine casualties. I think that's what we're trying to say, Seth.
That's exactly what we're trying to say. And, we always call Guadalcanal the schoolhouse. This isn't much different. We learned a lot from Tarawa. As one Marine general said, there had to be a Tarawa. And this, it informs literally everything that happens after it, in terms of amphibious landings. And this stretches all the way into Normandy. There are underwater demolition teams that go ashore at Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. So this is something that stretches all the way through the end of the war. Now, Bill, talking, we mentioned a lot of people in this episode, and some of these people you're going to hear again as the war continues, but kind of because we featured so heavily on these individual personalities, kind of wanted to wrap these guys up in a little bit of a bow and let you know what happened to some of these cats. Norman Hatch, guy, is a good buddy of mine, or was, God bless him, a good buddy of mine, who we mentioned a lot. And most of the footage you see in these last few episodes was his. He would return to combat in 1945 on a little island called Iwo Jima, where he would be responsible for documenting the entire campaign. So when he lands ashore on Iwo Jima, he is in charge of the entire Marine Corps combat cameramen that are assigned to document Iwo Jima. So Norm sees two of the worst battles of the entire Pacific War firsthand. David Shoup is going to be the only living Medal of Honor recipient from Betio. We're not going to go through his citation minute by minute or word by word, but just suffice it to say, the three that were awarded it posthumously, Bordelon, Hawkins, Bonnyman, they all did their actions and died, performing the actions that got them the medal. Shoup is awarded the medal for his leadership. And there is no question at all that without David Monroe Shoup on Red Beach 2 on D-Day until the time he was relieved by Merritt Edson, things go probably very drastically different than they already do on Betio. Shoup provides a steady leadership. He is, the steady influencing go-getter that General Julian Smith assigned to this action. So his assignment as the head man on Betio when the assault forces hit proves to be 100% the right choice. Following Betio, Shoup would become the chief of staff for the 2nd Marine Division, planning and landing at Saipan and Tinian in 1944. He would later eventually become the 22nd Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Bill, what happens to some of our other people here?
Now, you remember our famous Henry Pearson Crow. He's going to stay with the 2nd Marine Division. He's going to land on Saipan, where he was seriously wounded. He would survive Saipan and stay in the Corps and retire as a full bird colonel after 40 years of service. He was awarded a Navy Cross for his actions on Betio. And then his XO, the college professor who so fiercely led his men on Betio throughout the fight, Major William Chamberlain, also stayed in the Corps. He would fight on Saipan and Tinian, where he would be awarded the Silver Star for each of those actions, along with the Purple Heart. And he too was awarded the Navy Cross for leadership and actions on Betio. Chamberlain retired from the Corps after 30 years, and then finally went back to being a professor. A fitting closing to the Tarawa Betio chapter of our show would be to read the epitaph directed by the Marines themselves at one of the many cemeteries that dotted Betio's bloody sands. So let them rest on their sun-scoured atoll, the wind for their watcher, the wave for their shroud, where palm and pandanus shall whisper forever, a requiem fitting for heroes so proud, unquote.
Yep. That is really the only way that we could end this trio of episodes on Operation Galvanic and the assault on Betio. One of the most horrendous fights of the Second World War, certainly one of the most horrendous fights in Marine Corps history, and an inflection point that Bill always talks about. This is an inflection point in the Pacific War. Everything that happens after Betio is because of Betio. Every single thing that is learned, they're good and bad, is a reflection. It causes a reflection in every single amphibious operation that happens for the Allied side on both sides of the world for the remainder of the war. This is a huge deal. We hope we conveyed that to everybody. It was a vicious, bloody fight. It was incredibly important, and it informed so much that we felt like we had to spend this amount of time on this particular thing. Bill, do you have anything? Go ahead.
Yeah, when we say that Tarawa had to happen, what we mean is these lessons had to be learned. And if they weren't learned here, they would have been learned on Kwajalein, on Eniwetok, on somewhere else that will be heavily defended in order for us to succeed at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. And people say, yeah, but all these people didn't need to die learning those lessons, and 100% true, agree completely. But people would have died learning them wherever these lessons were learned. And I can think of scenarios where it would have been even bloodier. So, these what-if drills are of no value. What is important is that we took every lesson out of the experience of Tarawa that we could possibly take out of it for the benefit of Anzio, for the benefit of Saipan and Tinian and Iwo Jima eventually. And I think we could reasonably say that we did learn those lessons effectively, and the rest of the war benefited from it.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that you are 100% correct. So this episode effectively wraps season 2 for our show. We felt that Betio was an appropriate ending topic for this season. We are well aware that there are other 1943 related topics, not the least of which is Cape Gloucester, that we have not covered. We will get to those in season 3, as well as many, many others. This next season, which we will start recording here in the next couple of weeks, promises to be our biggest and probably most important season yet, as we dive into the bloodletting that it was 1944. In this next season, we're going to explore topics like the Marshals, the Army's role in the Pacific, specifically Biak, Aitape, and the Philippines, and more. The Central Pacific Drive, of course, will take center stage as we really get into the Marianas Operation and Operation Forager and all the material that goes with that. Look for the much anticipated action-by-action breakdown of the epic Leyte Gulf fight as well. That's plenty of topics to talk about there. We're also going to get into some pretty deep topics that we haven't gotten into yet, some philosophical discussions that we think are both important and we hope entertaining as well. We'll also have some new guests on this season, people you've probably heard of or at the very least read before, as well as some of our old friends too. So with that being said, Operation Galvanic closes out this season officially. But the next 2 weeks, we have some really, really, really super cool material for you as we record the first few episodes of season 3. Bill, can you tell us a little bit about what's coming up in the next 2 weeks?
Sure, Seth. Well, for the first time, I went on the road to record episodes of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War. Specifically in June, I went to Pearl Harbor, where the Navy was kind enough to give me access to many of the sites that I frequented or occupied when I was on active duty. So I recorded 2 episodes out of Pearl Harbor, and those 2 episodes will be released in the next 2 weeks. Now, in our podcast, we never, to my knowledge, discovered new history as part of our podcast. For the most part, we are recounting history that's already been written about. But in the course of my research into the Pearl Harbor locations, I did discover something that I don't think anyone has ever written about before. And we're going to do a great reveal in next week's podcast. And I hope you all appreciate what we have. And little teaser, it has something to do with the Battle of Midway. And I'm not even sure John Parshall knows what it is that we're going to be revealing in next week's episode. Last thing I want to say, it's kind of an apology in advance, is going on the road for the first time. I was learning how to do audio recording, and some of my audio is a little bit rough because, again, I learned lessons from going on the road that I don't have to relearn now. But in the course of learning those lessons, I did some audio recording for the podcast that didn't turn out so well. So I apologize for that in advance. I hope it's still worth watching and listening to. And with that, Seth, back to you.
Yep. And it is. I'm just going to let you guys know. So it's cool stuff. Check it out. I was in Pearl Harbor with the family back in January, and I saw some of the sites that Bill saw and some of the things I couldn't go to because I had the wife and 2 kids in tow for obvious reasons. So the material that Bill is going to show or that we are going to show that Bill shot is absolutely fascinating. It is really, really cool. It's a virtual tour that the vast majority of you, unless you are a retired military or have a CAC card, you ain't going to see this stuff. And even if you are retired military, Bill had to pull some strings to be able to see some of this stuff. So it's really, really cool. Definitely well worth watching. I know for those who are listening, you're going, what the hell? Look us up on YouTube, check it out. Believe me, you're going to want to check it out. You're going to want to see it. It's really, really neat. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to see the video version of this or any of our other episodes, please look us up on YouTube. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. We do return your emails. Sometimes it takes weeks, but we do get to them, I promise you. So once again, my name is Seth Perrin. I want to say thank you very, very much for not only watching today, but watching this season. Bill.
And I'm Bill Tody. See you again out of Pearl Harbor next week.